Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited. Isis, Escape from Transylvania. The goddess next door and John Haynes must escape a horde of vampires on the hunt in this horror-filled Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Escape from Transylvania in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today. It was announced at New York Comic Con that DC Comics would be rebooting its DC Universe once again with an event called 5G. And in this 5G, we would be getting new versions of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, Green Lantern, and Aquaman, which would represent the fifth generation of heroes. And this fifth generation of heroes is supposed to be part of a brand new timeline that Dan Dido, the president and co-publisher of DC Comics, has created, where Wonder Woman is established as the first superhero. Now, there's a lot wrong with this whole 5G concept, and I'm going to go through what's wrong with this concept piece by piece. Now, the big problem with this 5G concept is that it takes all of the momentum of DC Rebirth and flushes it straight down the toilet. Now, many people, when they bought DC Rebirth a couple of years ago, they were anticipating a return to the classic DC universe and the iconic DC superheroes that many knew for multiple generations. And they thought that the Doomsday Clock storyline would lead to the end of the failed New 52, the failed Convergence, and the failed DC Rebirth, and most people were anticipating that the Rebirth would eventually lead to the return to the classic DC universe. This was the main reason why many people had an incentive to go out here and buy the comics of DC Rebirth, was they were anticipating a return to the classic characters many grew up with and many saw as icons as they passed these characters on from generation to generation. But it looks like after Jeff Johns, the architect of Rebirth, got promoted and moved to the DC television division, or the streaming division, that Dan Dido wound up back in charge of DC Comics Publishing Division, and as a result, all of the goodwill and momentum of DC Rebirth wound up falling completely apart. And as Dido brought back his dysfunctional story model of dreary, depressing stories, lots of violence and gore, and none of the hope and optimism of Rebirth, many comic fans began walking away from the entire DC Universe brands and the DC comics that were a part of this DC Universe. And as a result, sales have dropped, and now people are losing hope, because now with this 5G, we don't get any sort of hope of any sort of return to the classic DC universe. Even worse, we get a DC universe that does not fit within the standards of the traditional DC universe. Because to say that Wonder Woman is the first superhero, this just does not fit within the parameters for the DC universe. Because as American history states, Superman is the first DC superhero, and he predates Wonder Woman by several years. So to tell comic fans that Wonder Woman is the first DC superhero, this is a form of gaslighting by Dan Dido, and it's a form of gaslighting that just isn't going to work, because everybody knows that as part of American history, Superman is the first DC superhero, and he is the first icon of this whole superhero genre. So to tell us Wonder Woman is the first superhero is an insult to every comic fan out there. We all know that Action Comics #1 is the first comic book to feature Superman, and it is the first comic book to feature the modern superhero in a comic. So your Dan Dido has thrown up a middle finger up at all of the comic fans, Moreover, he has insulted all of the comic historians with this new convoluted timeline, which does not really fit within anything everybody knows historically. So 5G is already getting ready to start off on an even worse foot than the new 52, and your Dan Dido just doesn't understand why this isn't going to work, because if you tell people something they already know as a fact is not true, they're going to have no incentive to buy these comics when they start out. Now, the other big problem with your DC 5G is that we're being told that Superman is a part of a so-called second generation of heroes, and again, this is a lie. Superman is not a part of a second generation of heroes after Wonder Woman. Your Superman is the first superhero, plain and simple. This is a fact stated in American history. He is the first comic book superhero, and before him was Doc Savage and the Shadow back in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And superheroes were male because primarily the audience for superheroes came from Pulp Fiction, and Pulp Fiction was primarily created to sell stories to young boys. So what we have here over at DC is your Dan Dido participating in the same type of feminism and identity politics that Sana Amanat participates in over at Marvel. And this is something that's quite troubling, because if Dan Dido looked at Marvel's sales records these days, following her business model isn't something smart to do. Because Sana Amanat's business model over at Marvel, where she's preaching about identity politics, social justice, and forced diversity, has led to the Marvel brand declining 90% over the last 2 years, and the sales numbers continue to drop even further as we speak. I mean, at the start of the so-called SJW era at Marvel, the best-selling books were barely pulling 40,000, and these days those books are pulling at least about 50 to 60% less than they pull right now. And at DC right now, under the creative mismanagement of writers like Tom King, books like Batman, which used to sell 100,000 units, are struggling to sell 40 to 50,000 units, and the same thing with Superman, which was starting to see a resurgence under your Dan Jurgens and the creative team that got Superman back up. They managed to get the book back up to 40,000 in as related to orders, and people were getting good buzz for that book until your Dan Dido decided to hire Brian Michael Bendis, and ever since then, sales for Superman have declined. Now, this whole 5G story model, this is something, again, that is going to be a complete disaster, because everybody in the world knows that Superman is Clark Kent, Bruce Wayne is Batman, and Diana of Themyscira is Wonder Woman, and depending on how you are, it's either Wally West is the Flash, which is the Flash I grew up with, or Barry Allen, or your Kyle Rayner, or your John Stewart, or your Hal Jordan is Green Lantern. And to tell us that somebody else is going to be in these roles, you're already starting off on a bad foot, and this is not going to be something that's going to get you these so-called new readers. All it's going to do is drive away people from the comic book medium. The few remnants that are still buying comics on the regular, it's going to do is push those people out of the industry. And what your Dan Dido, like your Sana Amanat, believes is that new people are going to come in and replace them. But that's just not going to happen because of the distribution of comics. And this is something that your Dan Dido and many in the comic book industry don't understand. You're not going to get new readers because comics are not distributed in retail outlets. due to the fact that they're not returnable. So those new people, they're not going to buy any comics because they can't find any comics. And the regulars who have pull lists at these comic shops who bought these characters religiously, they have no incentive to buy these comics featuring these new characters because when they look at those so-called new characters, they see the same dysfunctional business model as SJW Marvel. And in SJW Marvel, they decided to replace iconic characters like Peter Parker Spider-Man, Steve Rogers Captain America, Tony Stark Iron Man, and Bruce Banner Hulk with these diversity versions of the characters, and they wound up alienating all of those white males who were buying these comics religiously, and even some of the black and non-black comic fans who knew these characters and had been reading their adventures for years. So that's why Marvel had that 90% drop in sales, and I believe that your DC Comics is going to experience the same 90 to possibly 95% drop in sales if they go through with their plans to give us this Jonathan Kent Superman, this Luke Fox Batman, and give us possibly Cassie Sandsmark as Wonder Woman, or somebody else in the role of Flash and Green Lantern, because that's not what the customers want, and that's not what the customers have been anticipating as related to the Doomsday Clock and related to DC Rebirth. And it seems like every time that Dan Dido starts to get momentum over at DC Comics in terms of sales, he becomes his own worst enemy in doing things to troll all of the comic fans out there by jerking people around. And then what he does, just as people are getting excited about DC Comics, is he decides to pull the rug out from under comic fans in the hopes of generating controversy online. Unfortunately, what he doesn't understand is that in the publishing world, you don't need to jerk the customers around, because at the end of the day, you want to get the customers' dollars in your pocket. And instead of Dan Dido paying off the customer and rewarding them for supporting the product, what he does is he tries to jerk the remaining few comic customers around and tries to do things to needle them. Unfortunately, not understanding that the anger he receives on those message boards, it does not turn into long-term sales, nor does it turn into the word of mouth that allows a book to generate sales momentum. And if you don't have a seasoned publishing pro at a comic company to explain this to people like Dan Dido, who are thinking that, oh, controversy is something good and an angry reader is an engaged reader, this is the reason why comic sales have dropped to all-time lows, even in the aftermath of things like your Comicsgate, which was designed to supposedly get comic sales back up and get comics back flowing. Unfortunately, well, as long as we still have people like your Dan Didos and your Sana Amanats running companies like DC and Marvel and wanting to push social justice agendas and do things to alienate comic fans, then people have no incentive to get back into a hobby that at this point is on the brink of falling completely apart. Because if DC does go ahead with this 5G plan, then I can guarantee you we are now in the final days of what is supposedly the comic book industry, because 5G, I guarantee you, will be a complete disaster on the level of SJW Marvel, and DC Comics will be the first company to go out as related to comics. And when DC goes out, it will take the comic book industry with it, because the only thing keeping many of these few remaining comic book stores open were DC Comics and Marvel Comics, but 5G and the SJW agendas that are going to probably be pushed in these comics are going to be the thing to drive people away from DC Comics and drive them away from the comic book industry, imploding the entire comic book industry. And your Dan Dido, who wants to be known for being someone great in the comic book industry, will go down in infamy as the man who destroyed the comic book industry because he was too inflexible as related to dealing with the issues of the comic book industry. Because your DC Comics right now, we need the classic heroes, we need the classic icons. We don't need another reboot of the DC universe that gives us yet another universe of characters we don't care about. We need to get those classic heroes back on the store shelves in order to get people excited about comics again. And what's really troubling about this whole 5G, this is supposed to be the 5th generation of heroes, is that this whole line doesn't even fit consistently in their whole DC cinematic universe, its DC animated universe, and it doesn't allow you to synergize those characters in order to get people to go buy comics. Because most people, again, know Bruce Wayne as Batman from the DC superhero movies and the upcoming The Batman. Most people know Clark Kent is Superman from the recent DC cinematic superhero movies. And the new Wonder Woman 84, which features Princess Diana, it's going to be hard to sell that movie when you have all those fans coming out of that movie. They're looking for a Wonder Woman comic, and then they see somebody else in it. So what we're seeing with your DC is they're following in Marvel's failed footsteps, and they're going to get the same failed results. But your Dan Dido believes that doing the exact same thing as Marvel is going to lead to a different result. Unfortunately, what he doesn't understand is the definition of insanity is doing the exact same thing and expecting a different result. And your Dan Dido has been doing the exact same thing for close to 20 years, and he thinks that he's going to get these different results. But when I look at the results of his sales have been declining for over 20 years, and sadly, no one at Warner Brothers or its new owner, AT&T, has the courage or the backbone or the stones to fire your Dan Dido in the face of all of these declining sales and replace him with a seasoned publishing professional who would be focused primarily on maintaining the integrity of the DC Comics characters, increasing the value of the DC Comics catalog as related to licensing and merchandising, and re-establishing the DC Comics characters as the icons that they are, so that they can continue increasing in value for the owners like AT&T. There is a desperate need for someone who has an objective understanding of the publishing business, someone who is focused on trying to get sales of DC Comics up, and someone who is focused on increasing the value of these characters so that they can be preserved for the next generation. Because Dan Dido's approach right now is going to drive away the few remaining comic fans, and what's going to happen is, in their search for these so-called new readers, like your Sana Amanat tried to go for these new readers, they're going to find that there is no new readers looking for these characters because no one's looking for them because of the fate of the distribution at Diamond Distributors, which keeps comics in comic book stores but does not get them in the hands of readers. And sadly, no one at Warner Brothers, DC Comics, or AT&T has connected the dots as related to what keeps comics out of the hands of readers. Instead, they keep coming up with event after event in the hopes of fixing their continuity and breaking it even further, not understanding that the real reason why nobody is buying comics is because no retailers have comics because they're not returnable, and they haven't connected this dot to understand this. But the complete reboot of the DC Universe couldn't come at a worse time because comic sales are at an all-time low, and the sales these days are primarily noted as sales to comic shops and not sales to comic readers, because it's sales to comic readers that are a big problem. Comic readers aren't buying comics, and most of those, because comic readers aren't buying comics, the word of mouth isn't being spread, and when people hear that Luke Fox is going to take over as Batman, and Jonathan Kent is going to take over as Superman. That doesn't give them incentive to go buy DC Comics, because when they think of those characters in the roles of their favorite characters, they say to themselves, this looks like SJW Marvel, and it looks like DC is getting ready to become something worse than SJW DC, and that worse could lead to the complete collapse of the comic book industry, because when you have books like Batman struggling with the writing of Tom King right now, the last thing we need is another rug yanked out from under the few comic fans that are still here to drive away on the remaining audience that still was buying comics. Because if we don't have those people buying comics, there is no industry. And I'm looking at the state of this industry, and I'm seeing the end coming sooner rather than later. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct publications, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, and the Spinsterella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com in the description box. There you can pick up my books in paperback and Kindle formats, and several are available on Kindle Unlimited if you have that subscription, and you can read those for free. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.